The afternoon sun hung low over Lincoln County in the autumn of 1918. Jackson Cole sat on the weathered porch of his ranch, his 77-year-old hands resting on the armrests of a chair worn smooth by half a century of use. Before him stretched 160 acres of New Mexico territory, the same land he had nearly lost 40 years prior. The barn, rebuilt and painted the same deep red as the original, stood as a monument to survival. His grandson Matthew, 18, and fresh from the Great War, sat beside him. The boy carried the same gray eyes as his grandfather, the same quiet way of observing the world before speaking. He had asked the question that old men both dread and secretly hope to hear. "Grandpa, you never told me how you met Grandma Elena." Jackson was silent for a long moment. He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a piece of turquoise polished smooth by decades of handling. The stone caught the dying light. 180 nights your great-uncle Samuel cried. Jackson began, his voice like gravel over stone. 47 people tried to help. 47 people walked away. I had $427 left to my name. 14 days until the bank took everything. And then she rode up to this house and said 5 words that changed all our lives. Matthew leaned forward. What did she say? "Now I am here." The old man closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they held the distant look of a man stepping backward through time. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand what those words meant, you need to know what this place looked like before she came. You need to understand what a man becomes when he has lost everything except the will to keep 3 children alive. Jackson turned the turquoise over in his palm. People in town said she killed 3 men. The truth is she saved 30 people. They said she was a witch. The truth is she was the only healer in 200 miles who understood that some sicknesses live in the soul, not the body. He paused, and in that pause Matthew heard all the words his grandfather was not saying. Isaiah, who died in the spring of 1877, shot in the back by rustlers who were never caught. It took me 2 years to understand what he had given me. And there was a bullet that nearly ended everything. It did not come from an enemy. It came from the man I trusted most. The old man stood, joints creaking like the floorboards beneath him. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked toward the small cemetery on the hill where 2 headstones stood side by side. Your grandmother passed in 1917. I should have told this story then, but I could not find the words. Now I think I understand why. Some stories need distance before you can see their shape. He turned back to his grandson. This is the story of how debt became duty, how duty became love, and how love became a legacy that put 43 descendants on this land. Matthew waited. It begins on March 15, 1878, the day I learned that the weight of silence can crush a man faster than any bullet. The morning came hard to Cole Ranch. Jackson woke to the sound he had woken to for 180 consecutive mornings. His son Samuel, 5 years old, crying with the relentless rhythm of a church bell, tolling disaster. The sound cut through the walls of the 20 by 24-foot cabin like a saw through green wood. He opened his eyes to the familiar sight of the ceiling beams, rough-hewn pine darkened by smoke and time. The smell hit him next. Unwashed bodies, stale coffee burned to the bottom of the pot, grease gone rancid in the cast-iron skillet, the accumulated debris of a household with no woman to manage it, no mother to hold it together. Jackson Cole was 37 years old. He looked 50. The war had put a scar down his left forearm, a jagged line of puckered flesh from a Confederate bayonet at Antietam in 1862. That scar he could live with. The scars that came after the ones that lived in his sleep and made his hands shake when he heard sudden loud noises, those were harder to bear. But harder still was the weight of 3 children who depended on him. Harder was watching his eldest son Thomas turn bitter and angry at 14. Harder was seeing his daughter Margaret retreat into silence at 9 years old. And hardest of all was the baby Samuel, who had cried every night since his mother Sarah died of consumption 2 years prior. Jackson pulled himself from bed. His feet hit the cold floor. The sound of Samuel's crying grew louder, a wail that held no words, only the pure, distilled anguish of a child who had lost the one person who made him feel safe. In the main room, Thomas stood over a smoking skillet. The boy was tall for 14, all sharp angles and harder edges. He wore the remnants of a shirt 2 sizes too small, his wrists jutting from the sleeves like fence posts. His face still soft with youth, but weathered by responsibility, twisted with frustration. "I burned it again," Thomas said without looking at his father. "3rd time this week." Margaret sat in the corner holding a cloth doll that had belonged to her mother. The girl said nothing. She rarely spoke anymore. She simply watched with eyes that had seen too much grief for 9 years. Samuel sat on the floor near the cold fireplace, his face red and streaked with tears. At 5 years old, he should have been running, playing, laughing. Instead, he existed in a perpetual state of mourning that no one could ease. Jackson crossed the room and picked up his youngest son. The boy's body was rigid, locked in the private hell of whatever nightmares haunted him. Jackson had tried everything: rocking, singing, walking the floor until dawn. Nothing worked. The crying would stop for an hour, maybe 2, then resume with renewed intensity. "How long last night?" Jackson asked. "Started at 8, Thomas said, scraping the ruined eggs into a bucket for the pigs. Did not stop until 4 this morning. I know because I counted every hour." Jackson felt the familiar weight of failure settle on his shoulders. He was a rancher. He could birth a calf, mend a fence break, a horse, but he could not comfort his own child. The sound of hoofbeats outside made Thomas look up sharply. "Someone's coming." Jackson set Samuel down and walked to the door. Through the gap in the frame he saw a woman on horseback, Rose McKinley, 34 years old, a widow who had been Sarah's closest friend. She had been helping at the ranch for 3 weeks, the 47th person to try. She dismounted and tied her horse with the efficient movements of someone who had made a decision and wanted it done quickly. Jackson opened the door. Rose stood in the yard, her face lined with exhaustion. She had been pretty once. Grief and hard work had filed away the softness. "Jackson," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes would not meet his. "I cannot do this anymore." He had heard these words 46 times before. Each time they landed like a blow to the chest. "The boy needs a doctor," Rose continued. "A real doctor. Not someone like me who can cook and clean, but cannot fix what is broken inside him." Jackson said nothing. What was there to say? She was right. Rose took a step closer. Her hand reached out, then fell back to her side. "I care for you, Jackson. You know I do. Sarah was my friend, and I want to help her children. But that sound, that crying, it gets into your head, and it does not leave. I wake up hearing it even when I am home in my own bed." She turned to her horse, then stopped. "There is something else I need to say, something Sarah told me before she died." Jackson waited. "She said if anything happened to her, if you ever needed help with the children, there was a woman, a healer. Sarah met her once in town. She said this woman had a gift for understanding suffering. What woman? I do not know her name. Sarah called her the one with the turquoise." Rose mounted her horse. She looked down at Jackson, and for a moment he saw something in her eyes that might have been love or might have been pity. "I am sorry, Jackson. I hope you find someone who can do what I could not." She rode away, dust rising in her wake. Jackson stood in the yard until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then he turned and went back inside where his children waited in the wreckage of another morning. By noon, Jackson had made his decision. He rode 12 miles into Prescott, leaving Thomas in charge with strict instructions to keep Margaret and Samuel inside. The journey took him through the country he knew by heart: red rock canyons, scrub brush, the endless sky that made a man feel both infinite and insignificant. The town of Prescott sat in a valley, its main street lined with false front buildings that promised more than they delivered. Jackson tied his horse outside the Catholic mission and went to find Father Miguel Rodriguez. The priest was 67, a slight man with hands gnarled by arthritis and eyes that had witnessed most of what humanity was capable of, both noble and terrible. He was tending the small garden behind the church when Jackson found him. "Father?" Miguel straightened slowly, one hand pressed to his lower back. "Jackson Cole, I was wondering when you would come. Rose McKinley said there is a healer, someone Sarah knew." The priest set down his trowel and brushed dirt from his hands. "There is. But you need to understand what you are asking for. I am asking for someone who can help my son. You are asking for Elena Redfeather. And Elena is not like other healers." Miguel gestured for Jackson to follow him into the church. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of incense and old wood. They sat in a pew near the front. "Elena is 29 years old," Miguel began. "Her mother was Apache. Her father was a French trader who disappeared when she was young. The mission raised her after her mother died. I taught her to read and write. She learned healing from Maria Tso, an Apache medicine woman. Why would Sarah recommend her? Because 8 years ago, during the scarlet fever outbreak, Elena saved 11 children when the town doctor had given up. She knows plants and herbs that white medicine has forgotten. She understands sickness of the spirit as well as the body." Miguel paused. "But there is more you need to know. 3 years ago, 4 ranchers tried to force themselves on her. She killed 3 of them. The 4th ran. The sheriff ruled it self-defense, but the town has not forgiven her. They call her the Witch of the Canyon. They say she curses anyone who crosses her." Jackson felt a cold weight in his stomach. "Is it true that she is a witch? No. That she is dangerous when threatened? Yes. That she is the best chance your son has? Also yes." The priest stood and walked to a cabinet near the altar. He withdrew a piece of paper and handed it to Jackson. It was a drawing, crude but effective. It showed a woman's face, dark eyes, high cheekbones, black hair. Around her neck was a piece of turquoise. "She lives alone in a cabin 3 miles north of here. She does not come to town often. When she does, people cross the street to avoid her." Jackson studied the drawing. "What does she charge?" "I do not know. Elena has her own sense of what is fair. Sometimes she asks for money, sometimes for labor, sometimes for nothing at all." Miguel placed a hand on Jackson's shoulder. "Be honest with her, Jackson. Elena can smell a lie from 100 yards. Treat her with respect and she will do the same. Try to deceive her and she will turn you away." Jackson folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "Will you take me to her? I will do better than that. I will send word that you are coming. If she agrees to see you, meet her here at the mission tomorrow at noon." Jackson returned to the mission the next day at the appointed hour. Father Miguel waited on the steps. Beside him stood a woman. She was not what Jackson had expected. Elena Redfeather was tall for a woman, perhaps 5 feet 6 inches. She wore a simple brown dress that had been mended multiple times, the stitching visible at the seams. Her hair was black and long, pulled back in a single braid that hung to the middle of her back. Her skin was the color of aged leather, darker than most of the white women in town, but lighter than full-blooded Apache. But it was her eyes that stopped Jackson. They were amber, the color of whiskey held up to sunlight. They looked at him with an intensity that felt like being seen all the way through to the bone. Around her neck on a leather cord hung a piece of turquoise the size of a silver dollar. "Mr. Cole," she said. Her voice was low and steady, with no trace of nervousness. "Father Miguel tells me you need help with your son." Jackson removed his hat. "Yes, ma'am. My boy Samuel. He has been crying for 6 months straight. Every night, 8 in the evening until 4 in the morning. Sometimes longer." "How old?" 5. "And his mother?" "Dead. 2 years from consumption." Elena nodded slowly. She did not offer condolences. Jackson appreciated that. Many people have tried to help. 47. For the first time, something flickered in Elena's eyes. It might have been surprise or respect or calculation. Jackson could not tell. They all left, every one. Elena walked down the steps and stood before him. She was close enough that Jackson could smell sage and something else, something green and growing. "I need to know something before we discuss terms, Mr. Cole. Do you trust me?" The question caught him off guard. The honest answer came out before he could stop it. "I do not know." Elena's expression did not change, but he thought he saw approval in those amber eyes. "Good. Honesty is better than false promises." She paused. "I will work for 3 months. If I cure your son, you pay me $100. If I cannot, you pay me $30 for my time and give me a place to stay for those 3 months. Jackson did a quick calculation. $100 was nearly a quarter of what he had left, but if she succeeded, it would be worth every penny. "I only have $427 to my name," he said. "I owe the bank $2,400. The debt comes due June 1st. That is 77 days from now. Then you do not have much choice, do you?" "No, ma'am, I do not." Elena held out her hand. Jackson took it. Her grip was firm and dry, the hand of someone who worked with plants and soil and fire. "I will come tomorrow morning. Have a room ready. I will need privacy to work." She released his hand and turned to go. "Miss Redfeather," Jackson called after her. She stopped. "Why are you doing this?" Elena looked back over her shoulder. "Because I know what it sounds like when a child cries out of grief. I was that child once, and someone helped me when no one else would." She walked away, leaving Jackson standing with Father Miguel on the mission steps. "You made the right choice," the priest said quietly. Jackson was not sure, but he knew it was the only choice he had left. The next morning, Elena arrived on a gray mare that looked as weathered and capable as its rider. She carried a leather saddlebag and a canvas pack. Jackson helped her dismount and tied the horse to the post. Thomas stood on the porch, arms crossed. When he saw Elena, his face went hard. "Pop," the boy said, his voice tight, "you brought an Apache here?" "Watch your mouth, Thomas. They killed Grandpa. They killed white settlers, and you are bringing one into our house." Elena stood perfectly still. She did not flinch. She did not argue. She simply looked at Thomas with those amber eyes until the boy had to look away. "I understand you hate me," Elena said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "I would feel the same in your position, but your brother is in pain. Let me help him first. After that, you can hate me as much as you want." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. He stormed into the house. Margaret appeared in the doorway, clutching her doll. She stared at Elena with wide eyes, but said nothing. From inside came the sound of Samuel's crying. Elena walked up the steps and past Margaret into the house. Jackson followed. The main room was worse than he remembered. Dishes piled in the basin, clothes strewn across chairs, the smell of unwashed bodies and spoiled food. Elena showed no reaction. She set her bags down and knelt beside Samuel. The boy sat on the floor, his small body rigid with distress. His face was red, his eyes swollen from crying. He looked at Elena with the wild terror of a trapped animal. Elena did not try to touch him. Instead, she opened her saddlebag and withdrew several small pouches. She laid them out on the floor in front of her. "Chamomile," she said quietly, more to herself than to Jackson. "Valerian root, golden seal, sage." She looked up at Jackson. "I will need hot water and privacy. Everyone except Samuel needs to leave this room for 1 hour." Jackson hesitated. "You want me to leave you alone with my son?" "Yes." "How do I know you will not hurt him?" Elena met his eyes. "You do not. You have to trust me, and we have already established that you do not." It was the truth. Jackson could not deny it, but he could choose to take a leap of faith. 1 hour, he said. He gathered Thomas and Margaret and took them outside. They sat on the porch steps in the morning sun, listening to the sound of Elena's voice drifting through the open door. She was singing something in a language Jackson did not understand. Apache, he assumed. The melody was simple and repetitive, a low humming that seemed to vibrate in the chest. Slowly, impossibly, Samuel's crying began to soften. Thomas looked at his father, eyes wide. "How is she doing that?" Jackson did not answer. He did not know. After 45 minutes, the crying stopped entirely. Jackson stood and walked to the door. Through the gap, he could see Elena sitting cross-legged on the floor, Samuel in her lap. The boy's eyes were closed. His breathing was deep and even. He was asleep. Elena looked up and met Jackson's gaze. She put a finger to her lips. Jackson backed away and returned to the steps. They waited another 15 minutes. Then Elena emerged carrying Samuel in her arms. She laid him gently on the small cot in the corner of the main room and covered him with a blanket. She turned to Jackson. There were dark circles under her eyes. She looked exhausted. "He will sleep for 4 hours," she said. "Maybe more. When he wakes, give him water and a small amount of food. Nothing heavy." "What did you do?" "I listened to his crying. I learned what it was saying. Then I answered it." Jackson stared at her. "How?" Elena picked up her bags. "Your son is not sick in his body, Mr. Cole. He is sick in his soul. He feels the grief in this house. He feels your pain, your anger, your fear. And because he is 5 years old, he cannot process those feelings, so they come out as crying." She walked to the door, then stopped. "I gave him herbs to calm his body, but what he really needed was for someone to tell him that he is safe, that he is loved, that the pain will not last forever." Jackson followed her outside. No one else could do that. Elena looked at him with something that might have been sadness. The other 47 tried to make him stop crying. "I let him cry until he was finished." She walked to her horse and began to unpack her belongings. "Which room is mine?" Jackson showed her to the small room off the kitchen. It had a narrow bed, a single window, and a chair. Elena set her bags down and surveyed the space without comment. "This will do." She turned to face him. "Now I need to be clear about the rules. I will care for Samuel. I will cook and clean if needed. But I will not be treated as a servant. I will not tolerate disrespect from your children. And I will not answer questions about my past unless I choose to." "Understood. One more thing. Do not come into my room without knocking. Do not touch my belongings. And if you see me gathering plants or preparing medicines, do not interfere." "Anything else?" Elena paused. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "There will be nights when I cannot sleep. When that happens, I will go outside. Do not follow me." "I am not running away. I just need space to breathe." Jackson nodded. They stood in silence for a moment, two people bound together by necessity and desperation, neither entirely sure they could trust the other. Finally, Elena spoke. "Your son will get better, Mr. Cole, but it will take time, and it will require all of us to change." "Change how?" "You will have to learn to let go of your grief. Thomas will have to let go of his anger. Margaret will have to find her voice again. And Samuel will have to learn that love does not always end in loss." She closed the door, leaving Jackson standing in the hallway with the impossible weight of hope beginning to settle in his chest. For the first time in 180 days, Cole Ranch was silent. And in that silence, Jackson Cole heard the faint sound of something he had forgotten existed: possibility. Samuel slept through the afternoon and into the evening. Jackson found himself walking past the boy's cot every half hour, checking to make sure the child was still breathing, still at peace. Each time he found Samuel exactly as Elena had left him, curled on his side, one small hand tucked beneath his cheek. It was the longest stretch of silence the house had known in 6 months. By sundown, the atmosphere in the Cole household had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Thomas moved through his chores with less violence in his movements, though his jaw remained tight whenever he glanced toward the kitchen where Elena was working. Margaret had crept closer to the stranger, watching from doorways, as Elena unpacked her herbs and arranged them in careful rows on the wooden counter. Jackson stood at the window, looking out at the land that might not be his much longer. 76 days until the bank came calling. $427 between his family and destitution. The mathematics of desperation were simple and unforgiving. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of Elena moving through the kitchen. She had asked for permission to clean, and he had given it. Now he listened to the rhythm of her work. Water poured into the basin, the scrape of a knife against a cutting board, the crackle of kindling catching fire in the stove. Ordinary sounds. Sounds that had been absent from this house for too long. When full dark settled over the canyon, Samuel woke. Jackson tensed, waiting for the crying to begin. Instead, he heard his son's voice, small and wondering. "Where is Mama?" Elena answered before Jackson could move. "Your Mama is not here, pequeño. But I am. My name is Elena." A pause. Then Samuel again. "Are you an angel? Mama said angels wear blue. You are wearing brown. I am not an angel. I am just a woman who knows about plants and healing. My tummy hurts. I know. That is because you have been crying for a very long time. Crying makes the stomach tight. I have something that will help." Jackson moved to the doorway and watched. Elena knelt beside the cot, a wooden cup in her hands. Steam rose from whatever liquid it contained. "This is tea made from chamomile and honey," she said. "It will taste sweet and make your belly feel better. Can you sit up for me?" Samuel pushed himself upright. His hair stood in wild tangles, his face still puffy from sleep and tears, but his eyes were clearer than Jackson had seen them in months. Elena helped him drink. Samuel made a face at the first sip, then drank more eagerly. "Good," Elena said. "Now I am going to tell you something important. Are you listening?" Samuel nodded. "The sadness you feel, the hurt in your chest, that is called grief. It is what happens when someone we love goes away and does not come back. Grief is very heavy. It feels like carrying a big rock everywhere you go." The boy's lower lip trembled. "I miss Mama. I know you do, and that is good. Missing someone means you love them. But Samuel, you have been carrying that rock all by yourself. That is too much for a little boy. Papa is sad too." Elena glanced at Jackson, then back to Samuel. "Yes, he is. So is your brother Thomas. And your sister Margaret. You are all carrying rocks. But here is the secret. When you share the weight, the rocks get lighter. Do you understand? I think so. You do not have to cry alone anymore. When you feel the sadness coming, you can tell me, or your papa, or Thomas or Margaret. We will help you carry it." Samuel looked past Elena to where Jackson stood in the doorway. "Papa." Jackson crossed the room and knelt beside the cot. He put his hand on his son's small shoulder. "I am here, Sam. I am right here." The boy's face crumpled. Tears came, but they were different tears. Not the endless wailing of the past 6 months, but the natural crying of a child who needed comfort and knew he would receive it. Jackson gathered Samuel into his arms. The boy buried his face in his father's shoulder and sobbed. Elena stood and quietly left the room, giving them privacy. Jackson held his son and felt something break open in his own chest. He had been so focused on stopping the crying, on fixing the problem, that he had forgotten the simple act of being present with the pain. Samuel cried for 10 minutes. Then the sobs subsided into hiccups, and the hiccups faded into quiet breathing. "Can I have more tea?" the boy asked. Jackson almost laughed. It was such a normal request, such an ordinary thing for a child to ask. "Yes, you can have more tea." That night, for the first time in 181 days, Samuel Cole went to sleep without crying himself into exhaustion. He simply closed his eyes, whispered good night to his father, and drifted away. Jackson emerged from the small bedroom to find Elena sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of something herbal steaming before her. The lamp cast warm light across her face, softening the hard edges. "How did you do that?" Jackson asked. Elena looked up. "I listened. Most people try to make pain go away quickly. They offer distractions or tell the hurting person to be strong. But pain needs to be acknowledged before it can heal. Jackson sat down across from her. You said you were that child once, the one who cried from grief. Elena's expression did not change, but something shuddered behind her eyes. I was 8 years old when my mother died. The mission took me in. For months I screamed every night. The sisters did not know what to do with me. Then one night an old Apache woman came to the mission. Her name was Maria Tso. She sat with me and let me cry until I had no tears left. Then she taught me about the plants that ease sorrow. Is that when you learn to heal? That is when I learned that healing is not about making pain disappear. It is about teaching people how to live with it. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a coyote called across the canyon. Its voice was lonely and wild. Thank you, Jackson said, for what you did today. Elena nodded once, accepting the gratitude without false modesty. It is only the first step, Mr. Cole. Samuel will have good days and hard days. There will be nights when the grief comes back, but each time it will be a little lighter. And the other 47 people could not do this. They tried to stop the symptom. I addressed the cause. She took a sip of her tea. Your son does not need less sadness. He needs more love. Jackson felt the words settle into him like stones dropping into water. I do love him. I know you do. But grief has made you forget how to show it. It was a hard truth delivered gently. Jackson wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he knew she was right. Elena stood and carried her cup to the basin. I am going outside for a while. I told you there would be nights when I cannot sleep. This is one of them. Is there anything I can do? No, just let me be. She walked out into the night, and Jackson was left alone with the lamplight and the quiet breathing of his sleeping children. For the first time in 2 years, the silence did not feel like abandonment. It felt like peace. The next morning brought the town. Jackson needed supplies, flour, coffee, lamp oil, things that could not be delayed even with a bank breathing down his neck. He hitched the wagon and brought Thomas, Margaret, and Samuel. Elena came as well, sitting in the back with the children. The 12-mile journey to Prescott took them through red rock country where the morning sun turned the canyon walls to fire. Samuel sat close to Elena, asking her questions about the plants they passed. She answered each one with patience, teaching him the names in both English and Apache. Margaret watched and listened, her doll clutched in her lap. Thomas drove the wagon in stony silence. When they reached Prescott, Jackson pulled up in front of the general store. The main street was busy with Saturday morning commerce, ranchers loading supplies, women with baskets, children running between the buildings. The moment Elena climbed down from the wagon, the activity stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. A woman Jackson recognized as Mrs. Harper, the banker's wife, pulled her daughter close and hurried across the street. Elena showed no reaction. She walked into the general store with her head high and her shoulders straight. Jackson followed with the children. Inside the store owner, a heavy man named Garrett, who had known Jackson for 15 years, looked up from his ledger. His eyes moved from Jackson to Elena and back again. Jackson Cole, Garrett said slowly, did not expect to see you today. Need supplies, Garrett. Flour, coffee, oil. I can get you those things. His gaze lingered on Elena. But I have to ask, is it true you have taken in the red feather woman? The store had gone quiet. 3 other customers pretended to browse while listening intently. Miss Redfeather is helping with my son, Jackson said evenly. She is a healer. She is a killer, said a voice from the back. An old rancher named Silas Cord stepped forward. Killed 3 men with her bare hands, they say. Put a curse on the 4th that made him go mad. Elena turned to face him. I killed 3 men who tried to rape me, she said, her voice clear and calm. The 4th ran away. There was no curse, just consequences. Silas spat tobacco juice into a can. You talk bold for a half-breed. Thomas stepped forward, his hand moving to his belt where he kept a knife. Jackson grabbed his son's shoulder. "That is enough," Jackson said. "Is it?" Mrs. Harper had entered the store, her daughter in tow. Jackson Sarah would be ashamed. "Bringing that woman into your home around your children, after what the Apache did to your father." Jackson felt the familiar rage building in his chest. His father had indeed been killed by Apache raiders in 1863. It was a wound that had never fully healed. But before he could respond, a small voice cut through the tension. "Miss Elena saved my brother." Everyone turned to look at Margaret. The girl stood beside Elena, her hand gripping the woman's skirt. It was the first time Jackson had heard his daughter speak to anyone outside the family in over a year. "She made Samuel stop crying," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. "None of you could do that. 47 people tried. She did it in one day." Mrs. Harper opened her mouth, but Margaret was not finished. "You are all mean, and you should be ashamed." The silence that followed was profound. Elena looked down at Margaret and placed a hand on the girl's head. It was a simple gesture, but Jackson saw the emotion that flickered across Elena's face. Gratitude, surprise, something deeper that he could not name. Garrett cleared his throat. "I will get your supplies, Jackson." The tension broke. People returned to their business. But Jackson felt the weight of their stares, heard the whispers that started the moment they thought he was out of earshot. They loaded the wagon and left town without further incident. But Jackson knew the damage was done. The town had made its position clear. Elena Redfeather was not welcome, and anyone who stood with her would share her isolation. They returned to the ranch in the early afternoon. Jackson was unhitching the horses when he saw the rider approaching from the south. Even from a distance, he recognized the figure. Cyrus Brennan rode a black gelding that cost more than most men earned in a year. He wore a suit tailored in Santa Fe, a gold watch chain glinting at his vest. Jackson's stomach tightened. Brennan was 42 years old, owner of the largest bank in 3 counties. He had cold blue eyes and the smooth hands of a man who had never worked the land he controlled. He smiled easily and meant none of it. "Jackson," Brennan called out as he dismounted. "Good to see you. Been meaning to ride out." "Mr. Brennan?" Brennan tied his horse and looked around the ranch with the appraising eye of a man who already considered it his property. "Place could use some work," he observed. "Barn needs paint. Fence is sagging on the north side. I will get to it." "Of course you will." Brennan's gaze shifted to Elena, who had emerged from the house with a bucket of wash water. "And who might this be?" "Miss Elena Redfeather. She is helping with the children." Brennan's eyebrows rose. "The healer. I have heard stories." "I am sure you have," Elena said. She dumped the water and went back inside without another word. Brennan watched her go, then turned back to Jackson. "Interesting choice hiring an Apache, especially given your family history. She is good at what she does." "I am sure she is." Brennan pulled an envelope from his coat. "But that is not why I am here. I wanted to remind you personally about your loan. $2,400 due June 1st. That is 76 days from now. I am aware." "Are you—" Brennan opened the envelope and withdrew a document. "Because I was reviewing your file and I noticed something curious. According to the original contract, there is a penalty clause for late payment, $800 in accumulated interest and fees." Jackson felt his blood go cold. "I never signed any such clause." Brennan held out the paper. Jackson snatched it and read quickly. There, in the 7th paragraph, was language he had never seen before. Compound interest, penalty fees, legal jargon that added up to financial ruin. "This was not in the original contract," Jackson said. "It is in the contract I have on file. And that is the contract that matters." Brennan folded his hands behind his back. "So the amount due is actually $3,200. Do you have that sum, Jackson?" Jackson could barely hear over the roaring in his ears. "You know I do not." "Then I am afraid the bank will have no choice but to foreclose on June 2nd. Brennan paused. "Unless—" "Unless what?" "Unless we can come to an alternative arrangement." Brennan gestured toward the house where Margaret had appeared in the doorway. "Your daughter is 9 years old. My son Daniel is 23. In 2 years she will be of marriageable age. If you agree to a betrothal now, I will forgive the entire debt, your ranch, your cattle, your future, all secure." The world seemed to tilt beneath Jackson's feet. "You want me to promise my daughter to your son? She is a child. She will grow. Daniel is a good boy. He will treat her well. She is 9 years old." Jackson repeated, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Brennan shrugged. "It is a business arrangement, Jackson, nothing personal. You have 14 days to consider. After that, the offer expires and the bank moves forward with foreclosure." He mounted his horse and looked down at Jackson with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. "Think about it. Your pride or your children's future. The choice is yours." He rode away, leaving Jackson standing in the yard with a fraudulent contract in his hands and murder in his heart. Elena emerged from the house. She had been listening. "How much do you owe?" $3,200. I have $427. Then you need $2,773 in 76 days. Jackson laughed a bitter sound. "Might as well be $1 million. Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "I have $340 saved. It is yours." Jackson stared at her. "I cannot take your money." "You can. You will. Because that little girl is not going to be sold to pay a debt her father did not make." "Why would you do this? You barely know us." Elena looked toward the house where Margaret stood watching them. "When I was 8 years old, a man saved me from slavery. He paid $200 he did not have. I asked him why. He said because it was the right thing to do." She met Jackson's eyes. That man had a scar on his left forearm, a scar from a bayonet wound. Jackson felt the world shift again, but in a different direction. "My brother Isaiah had a scar like that." "I know," Elena said quietly. "I recognized it the moment I saw yours. You carry your scars in the same place." The truth settled over them like dust after a storm. Isaiah, who had died a year ago. Isaiah, who had always been the better man, the kinder brother. Isaiah, who had apparently saved a terrified child and changed the course of her life. "He never told me," Jackson said. "He would not have. Your brother did not do good deeds for recognition." Elena turned to go back inside, then stopped. "We will find a way to save this ranch, Mr. Cole, not because I owe your family a debt, though I do, but because that banker threatened a child, and I do not let men like him win." She walked away, leaving Jackson alone with the knowledge that the woman he had hired to save his son might be the one to save them all. 23 days after Elena arrived at Cole Ranch, the night came alive with violence. Jackson woke to the sound that had haunted him since Antietam. Gunfire, not the crack of a hunter's rifle in the distance, but the rapid percussion of multiple weapons fired in anger. His hand went instinctively to the revolver he kept under his pillow, the Colt Navy, that had carried him through the war. He was out of bed and moving before his mind fully processed what was happening. Outside, the darkness was broken by orange flame. The barn. Someone had set fire to the barn. Jackson hit the main room at a run. Thomas was already there, pulling on his boots, a rifle in his hands. The boy's face was pale but determined. "How many?" Jackson asked. 6, maybe more. They are after the cattle." Through the window, Jackson could see shapes moving in the firelight. Men on horseback driving his 70 head of cattle toward the canyon pass. Rustlers. It happened sometimes in this country, but never with such brazen coordination. This was not opportunistic theft. This was planned. Margaret appeared in her nightdress, eyes wide with fear. Samuel clung to her hand, his face buried against her side. "Get them to the root cellar," Jackson told Thomas. "Bar the door from inside. Do not come out until I say." "I can fight," Thomas said. "You can protect your brother and sister. That is the fight I need from you." The boy wanted to argue. Jackson saw it in his eyes. But Thomas nodded and ushered the younger children toward the trapdoor that led beneath the kitchen. Jackson turned to find Elena standing in the doorway of her room. She wore the same brown dress she had arrived in, But in her hand she held something he had not seen before. A bow. Not the crude weapon of amateur hunters, but a recurve bow of Apache design, the wood dark and polished smooth by use. At her hip hung a knife with a bone handle. "You know how to use those?" Jackson asked. "Yes." No hesitation, no bravado, just simple fact. "Stay inside," Jackson said. "Keep the children safe." Elena moved past him to the window. She studied the scene outside with the focused intensity of someone assessing a battlefield. "There are 8 of them," she said. 2 watching the house, 6 driving the cattle. They will burn the barn to cover their tracks and draw you outside. When you run to save the animals, they will shoot you." Jackson looked at her. "How do you know this?" "Because it is what I would do." She notched an arrow and tested the string. The movement was smooth and practiced. "You cannot stay inside while they take everything I own," Jackson said. "I did not say we would stay inside. I said that is what they expect." Elena glanced at him. There is a difference. Before Jackson could respond, a voice called out from the darkness. "Cole, we know you are in there. Come out and this goes easy. Stay inside and we burn the house with you in it." The voice was rough-edged with the confidence of a man who held all the cards. Jackson moved to the door, but Elena grabbed his arm. "If you go out there, you die." "If I stay in here, my children burn. There is a third option." Elena pointed toward the back window. "I go out the back, circle around. Take the 2 watching the house. You go out the front when I signal. We catch them between us." "That is too dangerous." "Everything is dangerous, Mr. Cole. The question is whether we die doing nothing or die fighting." She was right. Jackson hated it, but she was right. "What is the signal?" "You will know." Elena moved to the back window and slipped through with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to move silently through hostile territory. She disappeared into the darkness like smoke. Jackson waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Colt felt heavy in his hand. Through the front window, he could see the barn fully engulfed now. Flames climbed the walls and licked at the roof. His horses were inside. He could hear them screaming. Then one of the men watching the house made a sound, not a shout, just a wet gurgle that cut off abruptly. The signal. Jackson kicked open the front door and came out firing. The second watcher turned toward him, rifle rising. Jackson shot him twice in the chest. The man went down in a heap. From the barn area, the rustlers reacted instantly. 3 of them wheeled their horses and charged toward the house, guns blazing. Wood splintered around Jackson as bullets tore into the doorframe. He dropped to one knee and fired methodically. 1 shot. 1 rustler clutching his shoulder. Another shot. A horse screaming and going down, throwing its rider. Then Elena appeared on the barn roof. Jackson had no idea how she had gotten up there. But she stood silhouetted against the flames, bow drawn, and she was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Her first arrow took a rustler through the throat. He toppled from his saddle without a sound. Her second arrow caught another in the shoulder, spinning him around. He tried to raise his pistol, but Thomas, who had disobeyed orders and come back up from the cellar, shot him from the window. The remaining rustlers scattered, realizing they were caught in a crossfire. One of them, a lean man on a paint horse, shouted orders. "Fall back, regroup at the canyon." But he did not retreat. Instead, he spurred his horse toward the house at a gallop. Jackson raised his pistol, but the hammer fell on an empty chamber. He had fired all 6 rounds. The rustler crashed through the front door. Jackson threw himself sideways, but the man was already past him, heading for the back rooms, for the children. Jackson scrambled to his feet and ran. He reached the kitchen just as the rustler grabbed Margaret by her hair and dragged her out, from where she had been hiding behind the table. The girl screamed. Samuel screamed. Thomas tried to bring his rifle around, but the rustler had a knife at Margaret's throat. "Drop it, boy," the rustler snarled, "or I open her up." Thomas lowered the rifle, his face twisted with impotent rage. The rustler backed toward the door Margaret held against his chest like a shield. "Now you are all going to stand real still while I take this little darling for insurance. You try to follow and she dies, understand? Jackson raised his hand slowly. Let her go. Take me instead. I do not want you, old man. I want collateral. The rustler was nearly to the door when Elena stepped into the doorway behind him. She moved with impossible speed. One hand grabbed the wrist, holding the knife, wrenching it away from Margaret's throat. The other hand drove her own blade up under the rustler's ribs, angling toward the heart. The man gasped. His knife clattered to the floor. Elena twisted hers and stepped back as he collapsed. Margaret stumbled forward into Jackson's arms, sobbing. Elena wiped her blade on the dead man's shirt and sheathed it. Her face was spattered with blood. Her hands were steady. The others are getting away, she said calmly. We should pursue. Jackson stared at her. He had seen men kill in war. He had killed men himself. But he had never seen anyone kill with such cold efficiency, such complete absence of hesitation. Elena misread his expression. He threatened a child, she said. I do not apologize for protecting her. I am not asking you to apologize. Jackson gently moved Margaret toward Thomas. Stay with your brother and sister. Elena and I are going after the others. They took 2 horses from the corral, the ones that had been outside when the barn caught fire. Jackson led them toward the canyon at a gallop, following the trail of his stolen cattle. The rustlers had regrouped at the mouth of Red Canyon, a narrow passage between rock walls that glowed crimson in daylight and looked like the mouth of hell at night. They had left 2 men to guard the stolen herd while the others pressed forward. Jackson and Elena dismounted and approached on foot. The guards were nervous, jumpy. They had not expected resistance. They certainly had not expected to lose half their number. Elena notched an arrow. The one on the left, she whispered. She released. The arrow flew true. The guard fell from his horse without a sound. The second guard wheeled toward them, pistol raised. Jackson shot him before he could fire. The man fell backward over his saddle and hit the ground hard. The gunfire echoed through the canyon. From deeper in the pass, a voice called out, "That you, Cole?" The voice was familiar in a way that made Jackson's skin crawl. He knew that voice. From where a man emerged from the shadows, hands raised in apparent surrender. He was lean and weathered, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw. "Cole Maddox," the man said, grinning. "Though most folks call me Snake. You probably do not remember me. But I remember you. You and your brother Isaiah fought together at Glorietta Pass back in '63. Jackson's mind raced backward through the years. Glorietta Pass, the battle that had broken the Confederate push into New Mexico. He had been 22 years old, Isaiah 24. They had fought side by side through 3 days of chaos. And this man had been there. "You were a scout," Jackson said slowly. "Still am, just for different employers these days." Maddox's eyes shifted to Elena, and his grin widened. "Well, well, little Nayland Redfeather, all grown up and still alive. I am impressed." Elena went rigid beside Jackson. Maddox laughed. "But your brother, the righteous Isaiah Cole, he tracked me down, paid $250 to buy her freedom. Then he let her go. Can you imagine spending money on a half-breed and getting nothing in return?" Elena's voice cut through the darkness, cold and sharp as her blade. "He got something in return. He got to be a better man than you could ever dream of being." Maddox shrugged. "Maybe. But he is dead and I am alive, so who won that bargain?" His hand drifted toward his gun. "Now I am going to make you both an offer. You turn around, go back to your ranch, and forget this happened. In exchange, I let you live." "Who hired you?" Jackson demanded. "That is the question, ain't it?" Maddox smiled. "Cyrus Brennan sends his regards, and Victor Langford wants you to know that this land is worth more to him than your life. There is a $5,000 bounty on your head, Cole, dead or alive, but preferably dead. I am here to collect." Jackson raised his pistol, but Maddox was faster. His shot went wide, but close enough that Jackson felt the heat of the bullet pass his ear. Elena moved like water. She was behind Maddox before the man could fire again, her knife flashing in the moonlight. Maddox turned, bringing his gun around, but Elena was already inside his guard. She drove the blade into his side, not deep enough to kill immediately, but enough to shock him into dropping the pistol. They grappled. Maddox was bigger, stronger, but Elena fought with the desperate precision of someone who had survived by being faster and smarter than her enemies. Jackson circled, trying to get a clear shot, but they were moving too fast, too close together. Maddox got a hand around Elena's throat. She brought her knee up hard into his groin. He gasped and loosened his grip. She twisted free, and he reached for the knife in his boot. Jackson fired. The bullet caught Maddox in the shoulder, spinning him around. Elena retrieved her knife from where it had fallen, and as Maddox turned back toward them, fumbling for his pistol with his offhand, she stepped forward and drove the blade up under his chin. Maddox's eyes went wide. Blood spilled over his lips. He sank to his knees, then fell forward onto his face. Elena stood over him, breathing hard. In the moonlight, Jackson could see that she was shaking. He holstered his pistol and moved to her side. "Are you hurt?" "No." Her voice was steady, but her hands told a different story. "I am not hurt." Maddox coughed. Incredibly, he was still alive. Jackson knelt beside him. "How many more are coming?" Maddox's laugh was a wet, bubbling sound. "Enough. Brennan wants your land. Langford wants the whole valley. You cannot fight them both, Cole. You are a dead man walking." "We will see about that." Maddox's eyes found Elena. "Should have stayed sold, girl. Would have saved yourself a lot of trouble." His eyes went glassy. His breathing stopped. Jackson stood and looked at Elena. She was staring at the dead man with an expression he could not read. "Thank you," he said, "for saving my life. And you for saving mine." She wiped her blade clean and looked at him. "We should go back. The children will be frightened." They rode back to the ranch in silence. The barn was still burning, though the worst of the fire had consumed itself. By dawn there would be nothing left but charred timber and ash. The cattle were scattered, but not gone. They would have to round them up at first light. 6 men lay dead. Jackson recognized none of them except Maddox. Hired guns from outside the territory, professional killers brought in to do what local men would not. Back at the house, Thomas had barricaded the door. When Jackson called out, the boy opened it and threw himself into his father's arms. He was 14 years old and trying desperately not to cry. "I thought they killed you," Thomas said. "Takes more than that to kill me." Jackson held his son for a moment, then gently pushed him back. "You did well tonight. You protected your brother and sister. Miss Elena killed the man who grabbed Maggie. I know." Thomas looked past his father to where Elena stood, blood still on her dress, her face streaked with soot. "She is not what I thought," the boy said quietly. "No," Jackson agreed. "She is not." Elena cleaned the blood from her hands and face in the basin. Jackson offered her whiskey, but she declined. Instead, she made tea from herbs in her bag and sat at the table, her hands wrapped around the cup. "Your shoulder is bleeding," she said. Jackson looked down. In the chaos, he had not noticed the graze wound, where a bullet had cleaved a furrow across his left shoulder. It was bleeding steadily. Elena stood and retrieved a needle and thread from her supplies. "Sit." Jackson sat. Elena pulled his shirt aside and examined the wound with professional detachment. "It needs stitches, 6, maybe 7. Do what you have to do." She threaded the needle. Her hands had stopped shaking. "This will hurt. I have had worse." She began to sew. The pain was sharp and immediate, but Jackson focused on her face instead of the needle. In the lamplight, he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the small scar on her chin, the strength in her jaw. "You have killed before tonight," he said. It was not a question. 5 times before tonight, all in self-defense. The 3 ranchers and 2 others, men who thought a woman alone was easy prey. She tied off a stitch and started another. "I do not enjoy killing Mr. Cole, but I have learned that the world does not care about what you enjoy. It cares about what you survive." Jackson reached up with his good hand and touched her wrist. She paused in her work. "You do not have to call me Mr. Cole. My name is Jackson. I know. And I know yours is Nalin. Elena is the name the mission gave you. She resumed stitching. I prefer Elena. Nalin was a child who could not protect herself. Elena is who I became. Elena, then. She tied off the last stitch and cut the thread. Her hand lingered on his shoulder for a moment longer than necessary. Jackson could feel the heat of her palm through the thin fabric of his shirt. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. An acknowledgement of what they had survived together, of what they might become. Jackson leaned forward slightly. Elena did not pull back. Then Thomas knocked on the doorframe. Pa Samuel is asking for you. The moment broke. Elena stood and gathered her supplies. I will check on Margaret, she said, and left the room. Jackson sat alone in the lamplight, his shoulder throbbing, his heart beating faster than the pain could explain. Outside, the barn collapsed with a sound like thunder. Sparks rose into the night sky and disappeared among the stars. And in the darkness beyond the ranch, Jackson knew men were planning his death. But for the first time in 2 years, he did not feel alone in facing it. 2 weeks after the Rustler attack, the mathematics of ruin arrived in the form of a letter. Jackson stood in the yard, the envelope bearing Brennan's bank seal heavy in his hands. The morning sun was bright and clean, the kind of light that made the Red Canyon walls glow like coals. It was a beautiful day. That made the contents of the letter somehow worse. Inside the house, he could hear Elena teaching Samuel his letters. The boy's voice, once used only for crying, now asked questions with the eager curiosity of a child discovering the world. Margaret sat with them, helping her younger brother trace the shapes of words in the dirt floor where Elena had smoothed a space for learning. Thomas was in the corral working with a half-broken mare. The boy had grown 2 inches in the past month, his shoulders broadening, his movements more assured. He still carried anger, but it no longer consumed him entirely. These small victories, these incremental healings, they mattered. They were the foundation Jackson was building toward a future. The letter in his hands threatened to demolish all of it. He broke the seal and read. The language was formal, dressed in legal terminology that could not disguise its essential brutality. The bank demanded payment of $3,200 by June 1st, not the original $2,400. The additional $800 came from a clause Jackson had never seen, inserted into page 7 of the contract under the heading Penalty Provisions for Default or Delayed Payment. Jackson read the paragraph 3 times. The words did not change. Compound interest at 15% per annum. Administrative fees. Legal costs for potential foreclosure proceedings. It added up to financial execution. May 15, 1878. 17 days until the deadline. Jackson had scraped together $427. Elena had given him her $340. Thomas had found and sold a small cache of his mother's jewelry for another $120. The sale of 6 calves to a passing cattle buyer had added another $80. Together they had $1,227. They were short by $1,973. It might as well have been $1 million. Jackson walked into the house. Elena looked up from where she knelt beside Samuel, her finger tracing a letter in the dirt. "What is wrong?" she asked. She had learned to read his face with unsettling accuracy. Jackson handed her the letter without speaking. Elena read it, her expression unchanging. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully and handed it back. "This clause," she said, "show me the original contract." Jackson retrieved the document from the tin box where he kept important papers. Elena spread both contracts on the table and studied them side by side. After several minutes, she pointed to the 7th page of the new contract. "Look at the ink here. It is darker than the rest of the page, and the paper, feel it." Jackson touched where she indicated. The texture was slightly different, almost imperceptibly rougher. "This page was added after you signed," Elena said. "Someone removed the original page 7 and replaced it with this one. The signatures were probably traced over. It is fraud. How do you know this? Because I have seen it before. When I was at the mission, Father Miguel showed me how dishonest men alter documents. He wanted me to be able to protect myself. She looked at Jackson. We need a lawyer. I cannot afford a lawyer. Then we find one who will work for what we can pay, or for what is right. Elena stood. There is a man in Santa Fe, Abraham Hoffman. He is Jewish. The town rejected him the way they rejected me. Father Miguel says he is brilliant, and he hates men like Brennan. Santa Fe is 15 miles. Then we ride 15 miles. Jackson wanted to argue. Wanted to say that it was hopeless that powerful men like Brennan always won, that fighting only prolonged the inevitable. But he looked at his children at the home they had clawed back from despair, and he could not give up. We leave at dawn, he said. They reached Santa Fe in the early afternoon, the sun high and merciless. The town was larger than Prescott, its streets a mixture of old Spanish architecture and newer American construction. The plaza bustled with commerce. Vendors sold produce and handcrafts, wagons loaded and unloaded goods. Elena led Jackson to a narrow street on the east side of town. The buildings here were older, some showing their adobe bones through peeling whitewash. She stopped in front of a door marked with a simple wooden sign, Abraham Hoffman, Attorney at Law. They climbed the stairs to a second-floor office. The door stood open. Inside, an older man sat at a desk piled high with books and papers. He was perhaps 52, with graying hair and spectacles perched on a prominent nose. His suit was well made, but old, the cuffs showing wear. He looked up as they entered. "Miss Redfeather," he said, rising. His voice carried the faint accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. "Father Miguel wrote that you might visit, and you must be Mr. Cole." They shook hands. Hoffman's grip was firm despite his age. "Please sit. Tell me about your problem." Jackson explained. The original loan, the altered contract, the impossible deadline. Hoffman listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Jackson finished, Hoffman held out his hand. "May I see the documents?" Jackson passed them over. Hoffman examined each page with the careful attention of a jeweler studying a stone. He held pages up to the light. He ran his fingers over the paper. He compared signatures with a magnifying glass. Finally, he set the documents down and removed his spectacles. "This is fraud," he said simply. "Quite obvious fraud, actually. Whoever did this was either incompetent or counting on you not to notice." "Can you prove it in court?" Hoffman's expression darkened. "That depends on which court. If this goes before Judge Harold Morrison here in Lincoln County, no amount of proof will matter. Morrison receives $1,000 per month from Victor Langford. He will rule in favor of Brennan regardless of evidence." "Then what do? We appeal to the Territorial Court in Albuquerque. Judge Augusta Sterling presides there. He is honest, old-fashioned. He believes in the law as it is written, not as wealthy men wish it to be." "How long would that take?" 3 months, perhaps 4. Jackson felt hope crumbling. "The foreclosure happens in 17 days. "I am aware." Hoffman leaned back in his chair. "However, there may be another approach, something faster, more direct." He stood and walked to a filing cabinet, withdrawing a folder. "I have been collecting evidence on Brennan and Langford for 2 years. They have done this to 12 other families. Some lost their land. Others were driven out. One man was found dead in an arroyo after he threatened to go to the territorial governor." Hoffman spread papers across his desk. Contracts, letters, testimony transcribed in careful handwriting. "If we could gather these families together, present a united front, we might force Brennan to back down. Not through the courts, but through public pressure. If 30 families stand together and say they will not pay fraudulent debts, if they threaten to write to newspapers in Denver and St. Louis, if they make enough noise that the territorial government has to investigate, then Brennan and Langford lose their power." Elena leaned forward. You are talking about organizing the community. Precisely. These people hate me, Elena said bluntly. They will not listen to an Apache woman. They will listen to their own self-interest. Hoffman looked at Jackson. But they will need a leader, someone they respect, someone who has suffered as they have suffered. Jackson understood what Hoffman was asking. I am a rancher, not a politician. You are a man who fought in the war, a man who lost his wife, a man trying to save his family. That is more powerful than any political speech. Hoffman pushed the folder toward Jackson. Take these names. Visit these families. Tell them what Brennan did to you. Ask them what Brennan did to them. Then gather them together and make them understand that alone you all fall. Together you might stand. Jackson looked at Elena. She nodded once. He took the folder. How much do you charge for this advice? For you, nothing. Hoffman smiled slightly. I am a Jew in a territory that barely tolerates Jews. Miss Redfeather is Apache in a land that despises Apaches. You, Mr. Cole, are a decent man in a world controlled by indecent ones. We are all fighting the same battle. The least I can do is share what I know. They left the office as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Jackson felt something he had not felt in months. Not hope exactly, but possibility. It took 4 days to visit the 12 families on Hoffman's list. They were scattered across Lincoln County, small ranches and homesteads clinging to existence in the unforgiving territory. Each family had a similar story. A loan taken in desperation, terms that changed without explanation, threats of foreclosure, the inexorable tightening of a financial noose. Some of the families were willing to fight. Others were too beaten down, too afraid of retribution. But by the evening of the 4th day, Jackson had commitments from 18 families, 18 households willing to stand together. Father Miguel agreed to host a meeting at the mission church. The date was set for May 20th, 5 days before the deadline. Jackson spent those 5 days preparing. He was not a natural speaker, but Elena helped him organize his thoughts. She made him practice his words until they felt less like a speech and more like a conversation. On the evening of May 20th, 37, people gathered in the mission church. Jackson stood at the front, his hat in his hands, and looked at the faces before him. Ranchers and farmers, men and women worn down by sun and struggle. People who had come because they had nothing left to lose. He told them what Brennan had done to him. He showed them the altered contract. He explained how Hoffman had traced the same pattern of fraud across a dozen families. Then he asked them to share their stories. One by one they spoke. A widow whose husband had died mysteriously after threatening to report Brennan to the marshal. A young couple who had lost 300 acres to a foreclosure based on debts they never incurred. An old man who had been ranching in New Mexico since before the territory had a name, now facing eviction at 70 years old. The stories built on each other, creating a tapestry of calculated cruelty. When the last person had spoken, Jackson stood again. Alone we lose. That is what Brennan counts on. He takes us one at a time, and we cannot fight back because we have no leverage. He paused. But if we stand together, if we all refuse to pay these fraudulent debts, if we write to every newspaper from here to Washington, if we make ourselves too loud to ignore, then maybe, just maybe, we force them to stop. A rancher named William Garrett stood. They will come after us. Brennan has hired guns. We all heard about the rustlers at your place. They will come after us whether we fight or not, Jackson said. At least this way we go down fighting. A woman in the back stood. Jackson recognized her. Mrs. Harper, the banker's wife who had condemned Elena in the general store weeks ago. Mr. Cole, she said, and her voice was not hostile now, just tired. My husband works for Brennan. I know things I should not know. She looked around the room. Brennan is planning to foreclose on all of you within the next month. He already has buyers lined up. Langford wants this entire valley for a railroad spur. They have already surveyed the route. Your land, all of it, sits right in the path. The room erupted in angry voices. Jackson raised his hand for quiet. Then we know what we are fighting. Not just our homes, our future, the future of this entire community. He looked at each person in turn. I am not asking you to trust me. I am asking you to trust each other. To believe that together we are stronger than any bank or cattle baron or corrupt judge. The room was silent. Then Father Miguel stood. I will stand with Mr. Cole. Elena stood. As will I. One by one the families rose, not all of them, but enough. 23 households committed to the fight. They signed a petition that night, a formal complaint to be delivered to the territorial governor with copies sent to newspapers in Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and Denver. Jackson felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. These people were trusting him. If he failed, they lost everything. But failure was not an option anymore. Jackson and Elena left the mission after midnight. Thomas had stayed at the ranch with the younger children. They rode home under a sky so thick with stars it looked like spilled salt. They were 3 miles from the ranch, passing through a narrow section of trail flanked by rock walls, when a figure stepped out from the shadows. Jackson's hand went to his pistol, but the figure raised both hands. Do not shoot. I am here to help. The voice was young, uncertain. Jackson recognized him as the moonlight illuminated his face. Daniel Brennan, the banker's son. 23 years old, tall and thin, with his father's blue eyes, but lacking his father's cruelty. What do you want? Jackson kept his hand on the pistol. To warn you. Daniel looked back over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. My father knows about the petition. He knows about the meeting tonight. He is planning something. What kind of something? An ambush. Tomorrow, when you ride to Albuquerque to file the complaint, he has hired 8 men, professional killers. They will be waiting at Red Canyon. Jackson felt his blood go cold. Why are you telling me this? Daniel's face twisted with something that might have been shame or might have been defiance. Because I am tired of being my father's son, because I look at what he does and I am sick with it. He glanced at Elena. And because your daughter Margaret looks at me like I might be someone worth knowing. I want to be that person, not the person my father is making me become. Elena urged her horse closer. If you betray your father, where will you go? I do not know. Maybe nowhere. Maybe I die tomorrow trying to make up for everything I have been part of. Daniel met her eyes. But at least I die trying to be decent. Jackson studied the young man. He saw genuine remorse, genuine fear, and beneath it all, a desperate hope for redemption. How many men? 8, led by a man named Rusty Pike. He was a Confederate officer during the war. He does not miss, and he does not hesitate. When they leave before dawn, they will be in position by the time you reach the canyon. Jackson made a decision. Come with us, back to the ranch. We will figure out what to do. Daniel shook his head. I cannot. If I disappear, my father will know I warned you. But I can be there tomorrow at the canyon. When the shooting starts, I will choose your side. That is suicide. Maybe, but it is my choice. Daniel turned to go, then stopped. Tell Margaret I am sorry for everything my family has done to hers. He vanished into the darkness. Jackson and Elena rode on in silence. When they reached the ranch, Jackson finally spoke. We are riding into a trap tomorrow. I know. We could go around, take a different route. And let them think we are afraid. Let them know Daniel warned us. Elena shook her head. We ride through the canyon, but we ride ready. Jackson looked at her in the dim light from the house. You do not have to come. This is not your fight. It became my fight the day I arrived at this ranch. She met his eyes. Where you go, I go. That is the end of it. And Jackson realized with sudden clarity that somewhere in the past weeks this woman had become more than a hired healer, more than an ally. She had become the person he could not imagine facing the world without. But he did not say that. There would be time for words after they survived tomorrow, if they survived tomorrow. They left the ranch before dawn when the sky was still the color of old iron. Jackson, Elena, and Thomas rode 3 abreast, the petition sealed in an oilcloth packet in Jackson's saddlebag. Behind them, the ranch sat quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. Margaret and Samuel were hidden in the root cellar with Maria So and young Kai, armed with rifles and instructions not to open the door for anyone except family. The ride to Albuquerque would take most of the day. But first they had to pass through Red Canyon. Jackson could feel the weight of the pistol at his hip. Beside him, Elena had her bow strung, and ready a quiver of arrows across her back. Thomas carried his rifle across his saddle, his young face set with determination that made him look older than his 14 years. The canyon entrance appeared as the sun broke over the eastern mountains. The walls rose 200 feet on either side, red sandstone carved by wind and water, into twisted shapes that looked like frozen flames. The pass was narrow, perhaps 30 feet at its widest point, the perfect place for an ambush. Jackson raised his hand. They stopped. "If Daniel was telling the truth, they are in there waiting," Jackson said quietly. "And if he was lying, we ride into a trap anyway," Elena replied. Thomas looked between them. "So what do we do?" Jackson studied the canyon walls. There were ledges, crevices, places where a man with a rifle could hide and have a clean shot at anyone passing below. "We go through," Jackson decided, "but we go ready. Thomas, you take the left wall. Watch for movement. Elena, you take the right. I will watch ahead. If shooting starts, scatter and find cover. Do not try to be a hero. Stay alive." They urged their horses forward into the canyon. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the stone walls. The morning light had not yet penetrated to the canyon floor. They moved through shadow, each rider's senses stretched to breaking. Jackson counted his heartbeats. 100, 200. The far end of the canyon was visible now, perhaps 300 yards ahead. They were going to make it. Then the first shot rang out. The bullet struck rock 2 feet from Jackson's head, spraying stone fragments. His horse reared. Jackson fought to control the animal as gunfire erupted from both sides of the canyon. 8 muzzle flashes, just as Daniel had said. Jackson threw himself from the saddle and rolled behind a boulder. Elena was already dismounted, bow in hand, scanning the ledges for targets. Thomas had taken cover behind a fallen rock. "There?" Elena shouted, pointing to a ledge on the left side. Jackson saw the figure, a man with a rifle reloading. Elena's arrow caught him in the shoulder. The man screamed and dropped his weapon, which clattered down the canyon wall. More shots. Bullets chipped away at their cover. Jackson counted muzzle flashes. 6 shooters still active, 2 on the left wall, 4 on the right. A voice echoed through the canyon, amplified by the stone. "Cole, you are trapped. Throw down your weapons and we let you live." It was a lie. Jackson knew it. The voice belonged to Rusty Pike, and men like Pike did not leave witnesses. "We have the high ground," Pike continued. "You cannot win. Make it easy on yourselves." Jackson risked a glance around the boulder. He could see Pike now standing on a ledge 40 feet up, silhouetted against the brightening sky. A big man, confident in his superiority of position. Elena notched another arrow. "I can hit him," she said. "Too far, the angle is wrong." "Then we need to move him." Before Jackson could ask what she meant, Elena stood and fired. The arrow flew high, not aimed at Pike, but at the man beside him. It struck true, and the man fell forward off the ledge with a scream that ended abruptly when he hit the canyon floor. Pike ducked back, startled. In that moment of distraction, a figure appeared on the ledge behind Pike. Daniel Brennan. The young man had a pistol in his hand. "Pike!" Daniel shouted. The gunman spun. Daniel fired. The shot went wide, but it gave Jackson the opening he needed. He stood and fired twice. Both bullets found Pike's chest. The big man staggered backward and fell tumbling down the canyon wall in a cascade of loose rock. Daniel stood on the ledge looking down at Jackson. For a moment their eyes met. Then one of Pike's men positioned on the opposite wall fired. The bullet caught Daniel in the side. The young man gasped and clutched at the wound, blood spreading across his shirt. He looked at Jackson again, and in his eyes was something like relief. "Tell her," Daniel said, his voice barely audible over the echo of gunfire. "Tell Margaret I tried." He pitched forward off the ledge. Jackson ran forward and caught him, but the fall and the bullet had done their work. Daniel Brennan died in Jackson Cole's arms, 23 years old, killed by the same violence his father had unleashed. "Pa behind you." Thomas's warning came just in time. Jackson dropped Daniel's body and rolled as a bullet struck where he had been standing. He came up firing, hitting the shooter in the leg. The remaining gunmen, seeing Pike dead and their ambush failing, broke and ran. They scrambled down from their positions and fled deeper into the canyon on foot, abandoning their horses. Elena fired twice more, wounding one, missing another. Then the canyon was silent except for the echo of retreating footsteps and the labored breathing of the living. Jackson knelt beside Daniel's body. The young man's eyes were still open, staring at the narrow strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. "He saved us," Thomas said quietly. "He tried to save himself," Jackson replied, "tried to be better than what he was born to be." He closed Daniel's eyes. "That is all any of us can do." They wrapped Daniel in a blanket and tied him across his horse. They would take the body to Albuquerque. The son deserved better than to be left in the canyon with the men who had killed him. They reached Albuquerque 3 hours later. The territorial court sat in the center of town, a 2-story building of adobe and wood that looked more substantial than it was. Abraham Hoffman met them on the steps. The lawyer's face was grim when he saw Daniel's body. "Brennan's son," Jackson said. "He warned us about the ambush, died helping us fight it off." Hoffman nodded slowly. "That will complicate things, but perhaps not in the way Cyrus expects." He gestured toward the courthouse. "Judge Sterling is waiting. We have 2 hours to present our case." The courtroom was simple. Wooden benches, a raised platform for the judge, a table for each side. Perhaps 30 people sat in the gallery, mostly ranchers and farmers who had signed the petition. Judge Augustus Sterling was 70 years old, his face a topographical map of wrinkles earned through decades on the bench. He wore spectacles that magnified his eyes to an unsettling degree. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat authority of a man who had heard every lie and learned to recognize truth by its absence. "This court is now in session. Mr. Hoffman, you may present your case." Hoffman stood. He was not a theatrical lawyer. He did not pace or gesture dramatically. He simply laid out the facts with the precision of a man building a wall, one stone at a time. He presented the original contract Jackson had signed. Then the altered contract Brennan had produced. He showed how the paper differed, how the ink was darker on page 7, how the signatures had been traced. Then he called witnesses. 12 families came forward one by one. Each told the same story. Loans taken in good faith. Terms that changed without explanation. Foreclosures based on debts that appeared from nowhere. Brennan's lawyer, a slick man from Santa Fe named Cordell, objected repeatedly. Sterling overruled him every time. Then Hoffman called Maria Tso. The old Apache woman walked to the witness chair with the dignity of age and survival. She wore traditional dress, her gray hair braided and wrapped. She spoke through a translator, her voice steady and clear. "I have known the Cole family for 15 years, Maria said. "Isaiah Cole saved my family when soldiers came to kill us. He hid us, fed us, risked his life for people he did not know." She looked directly at the judge. "Jackson Cole kept his brother's promise. He gave us shelter when we had nowhere else to go. These are men of honor. They do not lie about money." Cordell stood. "Your Honor, this woman is Apache. Her people are at war with the United States. Her testimony cannot be trusted." Sterling looked at Cordell over his spectacles. "Her people have been at war because men like your clients keep taking their land. Sit down, Mr. Cordell." Finally, Hoffman called Elena. She walked to the front of the courtroom, and every eye followed her. Jackson saw the judgment in those stares, saw the prejudice. But Elena stood straight and met the judge's gaze without flinching. Hoffman's questions were gentle. He asked about her history, about how she came to work for Jackson, about what she had witnessed. Then he asked the question that mattered. Miss Redfeather, in your professional opinion as a healer, was Samuel Cole suffering from a medical condition? No, he was suffering from grief, from the pain of losing his mother and feeling that pain reflected in everyone around him. And could anyone have helped him? Anyone who was willing to listen to his pain instead of trying to silence it? Why do you think 47 people failed before you? Elena paused. When she spoke, her voice carried through the courtroom. Because this territory is sick with the same disease that afflicted Samuel. It is grieving the violence of war, the loss of land, the destruction of old ways, and the uncertainty of new ones. And instead of acknowledging that grief, people try to silence it with alcohol, with violence, with greed. She looked at Brennan's lawyer. Men like Cyrus Brennan profit from that sickness. They take advantage of desperate people. They add pain to pain and call it business. Cordell shot to his feet. Objection. The witness is making speeches, not answering questions. Overruled, Sterling said quietly. The witness may continue. Elena turned back to the judge. I came to the Cole Ranch because I was paid to do so, but I stayed because I saw a family trying to heal, trying to build something good from terrible loss. And I saw men like Brennan trying to destroy that because it was profitable. She paused. If this court allows that destruction, then the sickness spreads, and more families break, and the grief goes on forever. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Sterling removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly. Then he put them back on and looked at both lawyers. I have heard enough. I will render my decision. He opened a folder and wrote for several minutes. Then he looked up. It is the finding of this court that the contract presented by Brennan's bank contains fraudulent alterations. The added penalty clauses are void. The original loan amount of $2,400 stands. However, given the evidence of systematic fraud affecting multiple families, I am ordering an investigation into all loans issued by Brennan's bank in the past 5 years. He banged his gavel. Furthermore, Mr. Cyrus Brennan is to appear before this court in 30 days to answer charges of fraud and conspiracy. Failure to appear will result in a warrant for his arrest. This court is adjourned. As they gathered their belongings, Sheriff Wade approached Jackson. The lawman looked uncomfortable, his hand fidgeting with his badge. Cole, there is something you should know about your brother Isaiah. Jackson stopped. What about him? Wade glanced around to ensure no one was listening. The rustlers who killed him in '77, they were not random thieves. Brennan paid them $500 because Isaiah had evidence of the land fraud. Jackson felt his blood run cold. His brother's death had not been an accident. It had been murder. Why are you telling me this now? Because with Brennan going down, I am choosing my side. Wade handed Jackson a folded paper. This is Isaiah's original testimony. He wrote it 2 days before he died. I was supposed to file it. Brennan paid me not to. Elena took the paper and read it. Her face hardened. This names everyone. Brennan, Langford, Judge Morrison, the surveyor who falsified documents. That is why they killed him, Wade said quietly, and that is why I stayed quiet. I was afraid I would be next. He looked at Jackson. I cannot bring your brother back, but I can help you finish what he started. The gallery erupted in cheers. Jackson felt Elena's hand find his. He squeezed it, unable to speak, past the emotion in his throat. They had won. But as they left the courthouse, Hoffman pulled Jackson aside. This is not over, the lawyer said quietly. Brennan still has power, and Victor Langford has more. They will not accept this quietly. What will they do? I do not know, but watch your back, Mr. Cole. Desperate men do desperate things. They rode back to the ranch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jackson felt exhausted, but triumphant. Thomas rode with his head high, proud of what they had accomplished. Elena was quiet, but Jackson could see satisfaction in the set of her shoulders. They were 2 miles from home when they saw the smoke. black smoke rising in a thick column against the evening sky. Jackson spurred his horse to a gallop. Elena and Thomas raced beside him. They crested the final ridge and looked down at the ranch. The house was surrounded by men on horseback. Jackson counted quickly. 12 riders. They had set fire to what remained of the barn and were now circling the house, firing rifles into the walls. From inside the house came the crack of return fire. Margaret and Samuel were fighting back with Maria and Kai. At the head of the attacking force sat a man Jackson recognized from wanted posters, Victor Langford. 58 years old, cattle baron, railroad magnate, the man who had orchestrated everything. Langford was shouting orders, directing his men to positions around the house. This was not a raid. It was a siege designed to burn the Cole family out or bury them inside. Jackson drew his pistol. Beside him, Elena notched an arrow. Thomas checked his rifle. 12 against 3, Thomas said. Bad odds. We have surprise, Jackson replied, and we have something to fight for. He looked at Elena. She looked back, and in her eyes, he saw the same fierce determination he felt burning in his own chest. Together, she asked. Together, he confirmed. They charged down the hill toward the ranch, 3 riders against 12, riding into fire and death with nothing but courage and desperation and the absolute refusal to let evil win. The final battle for Cole Ranch had begun. The 3 riders came down the hill like judgment from heaven. Langford's men heard the hoofbeats and turned, but they were too slow. Jackson fired twice before they could react, dropping 1 rider from his horse. Elena's arrow took another in the shoulder, spinning him around. Thomas, riding low over his saddle, fired his rifle and missed, but the shot was close enough to scatter 3 men seeking cover. The attackers wheeled their horses in confusion. They had expected to face a barricaded house, not a cavalry charge from behind. Jackson rode straight for Langford. The cattle baron saw him coming and raised a pistol, but Jackson was faster. He fired, and Langford's horse reared, throwing the older man to the ground. The pistol flew from Langford's hand and disappeared in the dust. Elena circled right, her bow singing. Arrow after arrow found targets. A man clutching his leg. Another with a shaft through his shoulder. She was not killing, Jackson realized. She was disabling, removing pieces from the board with surgical precision. Thomas rode for the house, shouting, "Margaret, Maria, it is us. We are here." The door burst open, and Margaret appeared with a rifle. Behind her, Maria Tso emerged, Kai at her side. They joined the fight with a fury born of hours spent trapped and terrified. The battle became chaos. Gunfire from all directions, horses screaming and men shouting. Dust rising in clouds that turned the evening light red and strange. One of Langford's men charged Jackson from the side. Jackson turned and fired, but the hammer fell on an empty chamber. The man raised his pistol. Before he could shoot, Thomas appeared and struck him across the face with the butt of his rifle. The man went down hard. "Reload!" Thomas shouted to his father. Jackson fumbled with his pistol hands, shaking from adrenaline. He managed to reload 3 chambers before another rider bore down on him. He fired once, twice. The second shot found its mark and the rider tumbled from his saddle. Elena had dismounted and was fighting on foot now. 2 men rushed her with knives. She dodged the first, brought her own blade up under the second man's arm. He screamed and fell back. The first man tried to grab her from behind, but she drove her elbow into his throat. He staggered away, choking. The tide was turning. Langford's men had come expecting easy victims. Instead, they found a coordinated defense that seemed impossible. Families did not fight like this. Isolated ranchers did not coordinate tactics like trained soldiers. But the Cole family was not isolated anymore, and they had learned to fight together. One by one, Langford's gunmen broke and ran. Some fled on horseback. Others ran on foot, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Within 10 minutes of Jackson's charge down the hill, only 4 men remained. Langford himself struggling to his feet, 2 gunmen who had taken cover behind a water trough, and a lean man with a scarred face who Jackson recognized. one of Pike's crew from the canyon, a survivor. The scarred man held Margaret. He had grabbed her while she was reloading, dragged her away from the house. Now he stood with a knife at her throat, using the 9-year-old girl as a shield. "Everybody stops," the man shouted, "or the girl dies." The shooting stopped. Jackson lowered his pistol but did not holster it. "Let her go," Jackson said, his voice deadly calm. "Not a chance. You are going to let me walk out of here, going to give me a horse and supplies. And when I am 5 miles away, I will leave the girl somewhere you can find her." "You know I cannot do that." The scarred man pressed the knife closer. A thin line of blood appeared on Margaret's neck. "Then watch her bleed." Margaret's eyes found her father's. She was terrified but not crying. She had learned too much in the past months to waste energy on tears. "It is all right, Papa," she said quietly. The words broke Jackson's heart and filled him with rage in equal measure. Elena was moving. Jackson saw it in his peripheral vision. She was circling wide, using the smoke and dust as cover. The scarred man had not noticed. He was focused entirely on Jackson. "I am waiting for an answer, Cole," the man said. Jackson met his daughter's eyes and saw her understanding, saw her trust that he would save her. "All right," Jackson said. "Take a horse, take supplies. Just let my daughter go." The scarred man smiled. "Smart choice." Elena struck. She came from the side fast and low. Her hand grabbed the wrist, holding the knife, wrenching it away from Margaret's throat. Her other hand drove her own blade up and into the man's side, angling toward his heart. The scarred man gasped and released Margaret. The girl ran to her father. Elena twisted her knife and stepped back as the man collapsed. The 2 remaining gunmen behind the water trough threw down their weapons and raised their hands. "We are done," one of them shouted. "Do not shoot. We surrender." Jackson walked toward them, pistol ready. Thomas moved to cover them from the other side. "Face down on the ground," Jackson ordered. "Hands behind your heads." They complied. Jackson kicked their guns away and motioned for Thomas to watch them. Then he turned to Langford. The cattle baron had recovered his feet and was backing slowly toward the remaining horses. He looked older than his 58 years, his expensive suit covered in dust and blood that might have been his own or might have belonged to someone else. "It is over, Langford," Jackson said. "It is never over." Langford's voice was hoarse but defiant. "I have lawyers. I have money. I have friends in the territorial government. You cannot touch me." "We already did." "The judge ruled against Brennan. There will be an investigation. Your whole operation is finished." Langford laughed a bitter sound. "You think one judge matters? I will appeal. I will delay. I will drag this out for years. And while I do, I will make your life hell. You will never know peace, Cole. Never know when I will strike next." He reached inside his coat. Jackson raised his pistol, but Elena was faster. Her arrow caught Langford in the shoulder, pinning his arm to his side. The cattle baron screamed and fell to his knees. Jackson walked forward and kicked away the small derringer Langford had been reaching for. "You are under arrest," Jackson said, "for attempted murder, for conspiracy to commit fraud, for everything you have done to this valley." Langford looked up at him, pain and hatred warring on his face. "You are just a rancher. You cannot arrest anyone." "Maybe not. But the territorial marshal can, and he is 3 hours behind us with a warrant." It was a bluff. Jackson had no idea if the marshal was coming, but Langford did not know that. The fight went out of the cattle baron. He sagged forward suddenly, looking every one of his years. "I built an empire," Langford whispered, "and you destroyed it." "You built it on stolen land and broken families," Jackson replied. "All we did was refuse to let you steal ours." Sheriff Wade arrived 2 hours later with a deputy and the news that the territorial marshal was indeed coming. Wade took custody of Langford and the surviving gunman. The sheriff looked uncomfortable doing it, given his history of taking Langford's money, but he had no choice with so many witnesses. "The judge is serious about the investigation," Wade said to Jackson. "I have been ordered to cooperate fully or face charges myself." "Good," Jackson said. "Start cooperating, by getting these men off my property. Wade and his deputy loaded the prisoners into a wagon and left. Jackson stood in the yard and looked at the damage. The barn was completely destroyed now, nothing but charred timbers and ash. The house had bullet holes in every wall. The corral fence was broken in 3 places, but they were alive, all of them. Thomas had a graze wound on his arm. Margaret had a cut on her neck from the knife, but it was shallow. Elena had bruises forming on her ribs where someone had kicked her during the fight. Maria and Kai were shaken but unharmed. Samuel had slept through most of it in the root cellar, protected by walls of earth and stone. Jackson gathered his children and held them. Margaret cried finally, letting out the fear she had held inside. Thomas stood stiff and proud, trying to be the man he was becoming. Samuel simply clung to his father and asked when they could have supper. That night they ate cold beans and hard biscuit by lamplight in the bullet-scarred house. It was not much of a meal, but it tasted like victory. 3 weeks later, on a morning when the air was cool and clean and the canyon walls glowed like copper, Jackson walked with Elena to the highest point on his property. They stood looking out over 160 acres of hard-won land. The new barn was half built, its frame rising against the sky. The house had been patched and would be painted when they could afford it. The cattle grazed in the south pasture, 70 head that had survived rustlers and raiders, and the machinations of powerful men. "I have been thinking," Jackson said. "About what?" "About debt. About how you came here because my father-in-law sold you to pay gambling debts. About how I hired you for money I barely had." Elena was quiet, waiting. "And I have been thinking about how sometimes the best things in life start with the worst reasons." He turned to face her. "You came here as an employee. You stayed because you are too stubborn to quit. But somewhere along the way, you became something else." "What did I become?" Jackson reached into his pocket and withdrew the piece of turquoise she had given Samuel that first day. The boy had offered it back to her a week ago, saying he did not need it anymore. Elena had told him to give it to his father for safekeeping. "You became the reason I remember how to hope," Jackson said. "You became the person who taught my children that family is not just blood. You became the woman I cannot imagine living without." He held out the turquoise. "Elena Redfeather, will you marry me?" Elena looked at the stone, then at Jackson. Her amber eyes held emotions he could not name but understood perfectly. "You do not need to pay me any more," she said softly. "I am not a debt you owe." "I know. That is why I am asking." She took the turquoise and closed her fingers around it. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." Jackson kissed her, then there on the hilltop, with the whole valley spread below them. It was not their first kiss. That had come 3 nights after the battle, when she was stitching a wound on his shoulder, and her hand had lingered too long, and he had leaned forward, and she had met him halfway. But this kiss was different. This one tasted like permanence, like promises made and meant, like the beginning of something that would outlast them both. They were married 4 months later in October in a ceremony that blended Catholic ritual with Apache tradition. Father Miguel presided. Maria So performed a blessing. 60 people attended, including every family that had signed the petition against Brennan. Thomas walked Elena down the aisle. Margaret and Samuel stood as witnesses. The whole thing cost $17 and was worth more than all the gold in California. Jackson was 37 years old and felt like he was beginning his life for the second time. Elena was 29 and looked at her new husband like he was the answer to questions she had stopped asking years ago. That night, they lay together in the house that had been his and was now theirs, and Jackson told her about the future he saw. "We will rebuild the barn by spring. We will buy more cattle with the settlement money from Brennan's estate. In 5 years, this ranch will be the strongest in the valley." "And what about the children?" Elena asked. "Thomas will take over the ranch someday. He has the mind for it. Margaret wants to teach. We will send her to school in Santa Fe when she is older. Samuel, I do not know yet. He is young. We will see what he becomes. And us. Jackson pulled her closer. We grow old together. We watch our children grow. We build something that lasts. That sounds like a good life, Elena said. It is the only life I want. 2 months after the wedding, a letter arrived from Washington, D.C. Jackson opened it on the porch, Elena reading over his shoulder. It was from the Department of the Interior Office of Indian Affairs. The letter stated that due to evidence of fraudulent land seizures in Lincoln County, the federal government was conducting a full audit. Furthermore, in recognition of the injustice done to the Apache people, whose lands had been illegally surveyed and sold, a portion of the recovered acreage would be returned to tribal ownership. At the bottom, in careful script, was a note. Mr. Cole, your brother Isaiah's testimony reached the right hands. Thank you for finishing his work. Augustus Sterling, Territorial Judge. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Your brother gave his life for this, and you made it count. Jackson folded the letter and placed it in the tin box where he kept important papers. Beside it was the piece of turquoise Isaiah's photograph and the original land deed. Some men leave gold when they die, Jackson said. Isaiah left something better. He left the truth. 3 years later, their first child was born. They named him Isaiah after the brother who had saved Elena and whose promise Jackson had kept. The boy had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and a stubbornness that suggested he had inherited the best and worst of both parents. 7 years after that, the ranch had grown to 320 acres. Elena's school had 40 students. Thomas, at 21, was deputy sheriff. Margaret was studying to be a teacher in Santa Fe. Samuel was learning medicine from the new doctor who had moved to Prescott. 15 years after the wedding, all of Jackson and Elena's children were grown. Thomas married and brought his wife to live at the ranch. Margaret opened her own school. Samuel became the first trained doctor in Lincoln County. The twins, Sarah and Nayland, born 2 years after Isaiah, grew into strong young women who knew exactly who they were and refused to apologize for it. The ranch prospered. Not just financially, though it did that too, but in the way that mattered most. It became a place where Apache and white children learned together, where families that had been enemies found common ground, where the old wounds began slowly and painfully to heal. In 1918, Jackson Cole sat on his porch and finished his story. Matthew, his grandson, sat in silence for a long moment. So that is how you met Grandma Elena. That is how we met, how we fought, how we survived. Jackson looked toward the small cemetery on the hill. She died last year, 68 years old, lived longer than anyone expected for a woman who had survived what she survived. Do you miss her? Every breath I take. Matthew stood and walked to the porch railing. He looked out at the ranch that his grandfather had saved and his grandmother had helped build. The fence is still standing, Matthew observed, after 40 years. The fence stands because we chose to protect what was inside, Jackson said. Not the land, not the cattle, the people. That is what your grandmother taught me. That is what I am teaching you. He stood slowly, joints creaking, and joined his grandson at the railing. In 7 years, this ranch will pass to your father, and someday it will pass to you. When it does, remember this. It was paid for with debt and blood and 47 failures. But it was built with love and stubbornness and the absolute refusal to let evil win. Matthew nodded. I will remember. Jackson reached into his pocket and withdrew the piece of turquoise. He had carried it every day since Elena's death. This belonged to your grandmother's mother. Elena gave it to me when I proposed. I want you to have it now. Grandpa, I cannot. You can, and you will. Because legacy is not just land, Matthew. It is memory. It is the stories we pass down and the values we refuse to abandon. He pressed the stone into his grandson's hand. Your grandmother came to this ranch with nothing but a bag of herbs and a history of pain. She left behind 43 descendants and a community that remembers her name with respect. That is legacy. Matthew closed his fingers around the turquoise. Thank you, Grandpa. They stood together in the fading light, 2 generations connected by blood and story and the unbreakable fence that still surrounded the land. 7 years later, in 1925, Jackson Cole died in his sleep at the age of 84. He was buried beside Elena on the hill overlooking the canyon. The funeral drew 200 people. His children spoke. His grandchildren sang. The entire valley came to pay respects to a man who had fought for what was right when it would have been easier to surrender. On his headstone, at the request of his children, they carved 5 words, "Now I am here." In 1985, Matthew Cole, aged 85, stood on the same porch where his grandfather had told him the story. Around him, 40 descendants of Jackson and Elena gathered for a reunion. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, some with skin as dark as Elena's, had been, some with eyes as gray as Jackson's most, some beautiful mixture of both. The barn still stood rebuilt and painted red. The house had been expanded, but the original walls remained. And the fence, repaired and maintained through 3 generations, still marked the boundaries of 160 acres that had cost everything and given back more than could be measured. Matthew told the story again that day. The story of 180 nights of crying, of 47 people who gave up, of a woman who said, "Now I am here," and meant it with every fiber of her being, of a man who learned that family was whoever chose to stay. And when he finished, he held up the piece of turquoise worn smooth now by decades of handling, and he said the words his grandfather had taught him. This ranch has stood for 107 years, not because the fence is strong, but because we chose to protect what was inside, not land, not cattle, family. The stone passed from his hand to his daughters, from her to her son. From generation to generation, a physical reminder of an impossible love story that had become the foundation of everything they were. And somewhere in the memory of stone and sky and the canyon that had witnessed it all, Jackson and Elena Cole rested together, their story told and retold until it became legend. The fence still stands, not because it is strong, but because they chose to protect what was inside.